Oh, thank you very much, Isabel, and thank you to the organisation for the opportunity to speak today. So I'll cover a number of areas, starting with the clinical trials, guidance on clinical trials, and then looking a bit further to the future, as well as to how the clinical trial landscape might change. Good. So first of all, I think one of the key things, and this is specific to the pandemic, but in the cardiology area, you're very familiar with this, is that large-scale, well-powered, randomized clinical trials are really important to generate sound evidence on the effects of therapeutics or vaccines against COVID-19. And I think Professor Levy referred to joining platform trials and being able to bring together resources, both in terms of building up the networks of clinical trial investigators, of the management of the trials and data management, and then being able to have the ability to compare data between different treatments and standard of care and their effects. So we've seen with the initiation of the pandemic a lot of research starting up, which is very laudable, but I think the big message is to researchers, please join together to form bigger trials rather than starting many small trials, and this remains valid. And as some treatments are discounted and others start to show promise as the pandemic continues, we need to ensure that we focus on really having large trials which can provide the robust evidence as quickly as is possible. But obviously clinical trials were already up and running, clinical trials that weren't for the treatment of COVID, but then also now quite a lot of trials have started and continue to start in investigating treatments of various aspects of COVID. So working with the European Commission and the national competent authorities through the heads of medicines agencies in Europe, we've prepared guidance on the management of clinical trials during COVID. First of all, focusing on the protection of the clinical trial participants, enabling as much as possible the continuation of their treatment, and in particular for important therapies, obviously people on important therapy, possibly in itself life-saving, they need to continue on their therapy as much as possible. Mitigating the burden on site staff and facilities, particularly in areas with high impact of COVID-19. Obviously, clinical facilities and hospitals have a major job to cope with the patients of COVID-19. So we need to be able to alleviate that burden, but also the challenges of social distancing, both for the site staff and for the patients themselves, and the protection of their own health and that of their families. That, turning up at hospital visits for regular clinical trials is probably not the best idea if that can be minimized. Clearly, at the beginning of the pandemic, the objective was, first of all, to prioritize clinical trials for the treatment of COVID or other life-threatening or debilitating conditions, and make sure that those could start up and could continue with the best conditions, but also then reflecting on ensuring the reliability of trial results, especially for our ongoing trials, to the extent possible. I think the data from Professor Levy on trials in startup and ongoing clinical trials as it's progressed month to month during the pandemic was really interesting. So the guidance covers a range of areas, and without going into these in detail, I think there are a number of important ones, particularly around initiating new trials. The message that particularly with the initiation of new trials, trial applications which were for treatment of COVID or COVID-related conditions and other important therapies would be prioritized, particularly also because the authorities themselves have a lot going on in order to manage the situation. Changes to ongoing trials, particularly to protect the participants, to enable them to continue therapy where possible. Safety reporting, which should continue. discussion on risk assessment, because it's important in making changes that the sponsor and the investigator together look at the risks that might be involved in the changes, or in continuing the study or in discontinuing it. How to interact with the authorities with amendments to trial protocols. Can these be done in a tell and do situation, because they need to be carried out urgently, and then the authorities are informed afterwards. Reaching agreements between the sponsors and sites, and indeed the participants, for instance, for home delivery of medicines. Issues around informed consent, but particularly obviously for people under treatment for COVID who are in isolation due to the infectious nature of the disease. Changes in distribution of medicinal products, other diagnostics or devices that may be related to the trial. Changes to monitoring, and obviously adopting remote monitoring techniques and greater use of centralized monitoring. A number of things which a lot of these things were in place to varying degrees in different trials, but it's definitely accelerated their use, and they weren't necessarily designed into the ongoing trials, so that the trials have had to be adapted to this more remote approach. It leads obviously to protocol deviations, patients not able to make visits, and therefore perhaps some of the tests that had been foreseen may not be possible, or have to be done at different intervals or in different ways. And then, some of the things may need to be reimbursed if through additional expenses to patients or investigators. In addition, we have the methodological aspects, obviously, and by that I mean the analysis and handling of the results. Clearly, if there have been missed tests, missed visits, follow-ups that have been conducted at different times, or perhaps an adaptation of the manner in which they were done, perhaps the use of local laboratories versus a central laboratory may mean that data have to be handled somewhat differently, and therefore our biostats working party has also looked at that. And I think the key messages are that sponsors should seek scientific advice once you've been able to assimilate the impact that this has had on ongoing trials. I mean, my impression from what we've heard from various sources, and I think it's a little bit reflected by the previous presentation, is that the processes have slowed down, but trials haven't so much been terminated. And I guess as the pandemic alleviates in cities and regions, that those trials will pick up again, but clearly there'll be a body of time during which various tests and evaluations of participants and site visits or interviews haven't been able to take place, and so coming along and discussing the impact of that, how to deal with that analysis, and certainly the message is that we'll be flexible and pragmatic looking at the assessment of affected trial data, but best to come for scientific advice to understand how to assess that rather than just waiting for the marketing application. So then just generally on the conduct of trials, and this is particularly then in relation to COVID trials, as of the 23rd of June, we've 347 trials which clinical trials applications have been lodged in the European EUDA-CT database. So this is for clinical trials being carried out in the EU, or with at least some of their sites in the EU. So far, 228 have been approved, 100 are under assessment, and 12 were withdrawn or refused. And among the trials, then the 2 were already going on before 2020, but were adapted to include COVID patients, including one on community-acquired pneumonia, where the COVID became a new arm in that. 34 were approved in March, 114 in April, 43 in May, and 37 so far in June. So that number will probably go up a bit more. Looking at all the trials and also the message about conducting large trials, just over 300 of the trials were carried out in only one member state, and 46 of these are commercial, so with farm industry sponsors, and 257 non-commercial academia, public bodies, and health institutions. 9 are in 2 member states, 4 academia, 5 pharma, 12 in 3 to 5 member states, 3 academia, 9 pharma industry, and 11 trials in more than 5 member states. I'm glad to say that number's gone up a bit, and 3 academia and 8 are in pharma. So I think this still serves to illustrate that we need to be able to build the clinical trial networks, and indeed in the public space, the organizations that can sponsor trials on a wider geographic basis across the member states, and indeed in a wider sense globally, because particularly where we're talking about COVID treatments, and as we come into as the vaccine trials will start to expand in the coming months, the prevalence of the pandemic will shift geographically, and we need to be sure we've got investigator networks and organizations who can sponsor the large trials that will be needed. And just as an insight into the kind of therapeutic areas that those trials have covered, and the numbers here are the numbers of trials, not the numbers of therapeutic entities. So obviously you can see at the top there from the first phase, the use of antimalarials, monoclonals, cardiovascular products of certain interest in the coagulopathy and anticoagulants, other combinations, so far 13 vaccine trials, but obviously expect that to expand, 9 antibiotic, and then quite a range of other treatments involved. So that's a brief overview of the items, and thank you very much. Perhaps one thing I'd add is that now with the looking to the future, the GCP, the ICH GCP is being revised and looking at how to have a different approach to clinical trials, particularly looking at the digital landscape, use of remote monitoring, centralized monitoring, decentralized trial considerations will also come, and also a proportionate way of applying the procedures in this. And we're reaching out to organizations in academia and also patients' representatives to contribute to that discussion. And we had a recent workshop at EMA with the Patients and Consumers and Healthcare Professionals Working Party, and indeed a presentation from the European Society of Cardiology, among others. And I think that's looking over the next year and a half as we develop that will be a very interesting part of really moving into the future with the way we run trials. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Please, Stefan.
Yeah, thanks for a great presentation. And there seems to be a lot of trials that are submitted for you, to you, and a lot of trials going in parallel. You have mentioned that, of course, it would in many cases be reasonable if investigators would join together to form larger trials rather than have smaller ones. Do you play any active role there in encouraging individuals to go together?
So I think, there are two comments I should make. One is that, of course, the actual authorization of clinical trials is the responsibility of the national competent authorities. So that interaction is at that level rather than the EMA. We're working closely, in particular in the COVID-19 treatment space, with our colleagues in the European Commission and the member states to look at how we can build clinical trial networks and enable investigators to come together in a larger landscape. And this is through activities that are being taken under the ERA, European Research Area versus Corona action plan of the European Commission. And there's one of the work streams is involved in looking at building up clinical trial networks. Yeah,
the related question comes from the audience, whether there is potentially a central patient portal to address patient questions around clinical trials. Is the EMA in any way involved in that, being an interface with patients who might have interest, and any contact or interface towards patients?
So we have our EU clinical trial register where patients can get information on clinical trials that have been authorized on COVID therapies. But more specifically, perhaps in the context, as I said, we'd had workshop with Patients and Consumers Working Party, which is composed of representatives of the many different patient organizations at European level. And although what I referred to was a workshop on the revision of good clinical practice, we've also had workshops with them, updating them on the progress with therapy and the research into COVID treatment, and we'll have further interactions with them in the coming months, so that we keep them up to speed with our own activities in that area.
Yeah, clearly a need. I mean, clearly a need for well-conducted research, and I think this is something that also transpired yesterday already during our webinar, that we have seen, this pressure coming from social media, this pressure to obtain information as fast as possible has negatively impacted quite a bit on also, in some cases, the quality of the reports that have been published rather hastily in some instances. What has been your impression around this flood of sometimes extremely small publications or questionable data sources that we've been seeing? I'm sure you're monitoring this very closely, Dr. Sweeney.
Mm-hmm. No, well, it's as you can see in the second slide, in the publication we'd issued, really encouraging the formation of large, robust, and well-designed trials. We have a process we've established, an EMA task force, COVID-19, which is established on the basis of our pandemic preparedness plan, which we had already built up from 2009, 2010, and there we have a process for enabling rapid scientific advice for people organizations, companies to come and get scientific advice to move forward. We've reviewing processes to assess data on an ongoing basis, so that we are prepared for marketing authorizations and to move quickly on those. And you can see with the information on remdesivir, for instance, illustrating that, but also have groups of experts who are looking at publications, emerging data coming from different sources to evaluate, look at it carefully, look at its robustness, and see how we can, how much we can rely on that, but being careful, because I think it's clear that whilst we need to move forward quickly with research and with the evaluation of research, we still need to maintain very robust scientific standards in evaluating the safety and efficacy of these products, and keep public confidence in those medicines, but assure that where medicines are rolled out to wider use, as much as possible, that those are medicines that are going to work, and if there is still uncertainty, that the evaluation of those is through robust and well-controlled and generally large clinical trials.
I mean, as you say, I couldn't agree more. I mean, confidence of the public in the way and the robustness in which medications are tested and approved are extremely important, because if the public distrusts, then they will not take the medications that are valuable, and they might turn towards medications that are not. So the confidence in the process is extremely important. I have also the notion that I have heard here and there is that some of these trials have difficulty enrolling, because at least in Europe, the number of COVID-19 patients is going down, and maybe faster so in some areas than expected. So now trials are running out of patients. Is that something that you experience on your side, that maybe trials need to be stopped, or is anything else, because the number of patients?
Clearly one of the challenges, and I think whilst it's obviously very good that the pandemic numbers are going down and being controlled, it does potentially make it more difficult to involve patients, and that's why we need, let's say, broader networks of investigators, and not just in one country or even in one continent, but that we're able to continue the research and continue to develop medicines with those centers where patients are still attending and need treatment, so that we can move that forward.
Isabel?
Yes, and with this regards, Elliot and Dr. Sweeney, the platform trials that you were talking about, are they trials that are run in one continent or globally? and how is it? How do you structure these trials? What are the rules of these trials? Because I think very few people know about these platform trials.
So I think there are a number of these. I mean, some have been run in a single country, others are global, and they have different management structures and ways of establishing, of bringing in additional treatment arms, and centralizing the analysis, randomization, and other aspects. So it's a bit hard to say that there's a single design or a single set of rules, but they clearly need to be robust in terms of their design, in terms of their endpoints, and data collection, and ensure that the comparability of the treatment arms and of patients recruited in different places is sustained.
Yeah.
Because
yes.
I'm sorry. Please. Yeah, I think just to pick up on one point you were making, it would be ideal if these trials were multi-regional, because the pandemic flares and subsides in different regions at different points in time. So having sites that are open in Asia Pacific, for instance, if the disease is flaring there, would be useful. If it's subsiding in Europe. And I think, for the listeners, that to me, the best example of a large multi-regional platform trial is the REMAP CAP study, which was deliberate. It was designed and initiated to essentially be a framework for studying pandemic countermeasures, and it just happened that the study started at precisely the right moment, though it was several years in the making. And it's a truly global enterprise with sites in Asia Pacific, in Europe, and in the Americas, and so they will have the capability to recruit from whatever regions are at any particular point in time most severely affected by the pandemic.
No, and it'll be particularly important now as we move into testing vaccines, because obviously in order to test the vaccine, you need a degree of the disease circulating, and where that will be at the time the vaccines become available, and they'll become available at different times. So it'll be really important to have large investigator networks across countries and continents.
And there have been quite a few questions coming in from our listeners. First one directly to the EMA. Has your work changed during the pandemic, your way of working in the EMA? So
we've three aspects to that. In ourselves, we are working remotely as this meeting is being carried out. Our scientific committees meet remotely. However, we have been able to maintain, if I can say, our routine work, so the non-COVID work, but equally we now have a very significant work which is specifically related to COVID, both in giving scientific advice, evaluating new therapies or repurposing of existing therapies, and working on the advice to vaccine developers, also working with our colleagues in the member states and at the European Commission in anticipating and planning for shortages of products, for instance, the ICU products that are being used, so the medicines that are used in ICU, but to treat COVID patients, where there's been a very large surge in demand as the pandemic has flared in different centres, and that has been very challenging as well. So I think that probably reflects the range of impact, but we have certainly been able to, and fortunately, just anecdotally, our experience in relocating from London and then relocating between buildings here meant we'd had a couple of periods of significant teleworking last year. So we were already set up a little bit without knowing it to address the challenge here. But I think the key thing is really that we have to continue to enable the authorization, pharmacovigilance, supervision of all the medicines for other diseases, but also be able to evaluate and deliver on the COVID treatments.
Oh yeah, that's something that comes back, right? Comes back in every aspect that we discussed. COVID-19 not only has direct impact, it has massive indirect impact in slowing, halting, preventing the normal business from happening. And I mean, this is something that, of course, in cardiovascular, we are so massively concerned about. Cardiovascular mortality remains to be, the most important one as far as we know. And any impact COVID-19 has on the treatment and the development of future treatments for cardiovascular disease might be substantial. Here's another question coming in. Is COVID-19 an opportunity for adaptive designs?
I would say yes. And many of the platform trials that are operating utilize adaptive methodologies. So to disqualify early therapies that appear to be ineffective and to bring into the testing framework other promising therapies. I think all the large platform studies incorporate frequent interim assessments with planned thresholds for discontinuation of futile therapy, and then in some cases plans for expansion of therapies that are exhibiting a promising treatment effect early in their course. And again, I think that probably the most advanced adaptive design that I've seen is the REMAP CAP trial, which I encourage people to look at it from a scientific point of view. Is extremely interesting.
Okay, thanks for that. When I saw the numbers, and Dr. Sweeney, correct me if I'm incorrect, that there are about 350 trials now registered in the EU, and I lack the frame of reference. To me, that seems like a very high number. But maybe you correct me and you say, for other diseases, we have 5,000 trials registered. I'm of course exaggerating a little bit here. To me, 347 clinical trials registered sounds like a lot, but maybe you can give us a bit of a perspective.
I suppose across all therapeutic areas in a given year, and this includes from many first-in-human bioequivalent studies, so quite small studies, as well as larger trials, we have about 4,000 new trials would start in a year. Mm-hmm. So if you looked at 350 you'd have to multiply that 4 to get a full year's worth. It's a lot.
It's a lot.
For sure. A lot of new trials starting up. We've seen some slowing of new trial applications. If I look at data this year compared to last year, probably we'll be able to understand that pattern better in a 2 or 3 months' time, and when things have settled down a little bit of what the impact has been on other therapeutic areas in terms of initiation of new trials or ongoing trials. But definitely there's a lot of research going on.
No, thank you for providing that reference. I mean, these are numbers that are not typically known to most of us. Thanks a lot. Yeah. Any further questions from the panel or from Isabel to Dr. Sweeney?
Dr. Sweeney, you also have mentioned a member state where there was a lot of trials, much more than in the others. Is it Germany or is it another country?
No, when I said trials in a single member state, I wasn't referring to one specific member state. I meant trials which are only carried out in one member state. They're scattered out in different countries, yeah.
So the vast majority is conducted only in one country.
The larger part of the trials have only one country in which they're conducted, but it's not the same country for each trial. Obviously.
Yeah.
That reflects the fact that most of these trials are relatively small, as you pointed out.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
But that's not a consistent pattern. There's some very large trials in a single country as well. But in general, we would encourage that they are more interlocking, because many of these are small trials but in very similar therapeutics and obviously a very similar therapeutic intent, and therefore if 4 or 5 of these trials were brought together, harmonise their inclusion criteria and endpoints, they'd have a single, much better, much more robust trial and still effectively studying the same medicines with the same endpoints.
And Dr. Sweeney, if I may ask a very personal question, but these are maybe sometimes the very informative ones. What makes you really excited when you see a trial submission? Is it a particularly clever design? Is it a particularly interesting new concept? what is it that makes you excited, and based on your experience, where you think, well, this is something that's going to be really interesting?
I mean, it's difficult to pick out a single thing, because there are certain trials that you see where you can see the potential of that to answer, I mean, what are hugely important questions for humanity now. It's really on a very large scale. You see trials where you have a very intriguing therapeutic approach, so which are also very exciting, novel approaches, novel types of medicines, novel approaches to vaccines that are coming forward. So there are a mix of things, but I think trials which have the potential to really answer the question very, very well for humanity, I think at this point in time are the key ones.
Well, thank you for that.